Naziema Jappie has an MA in Social Science, Industrial and Neighborhood Studies, and a BA in Social Science, Psychology and Sociology from the University of Natal, Durban, South Africa. Currently, she is the Dean of Students at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. She is also a member of the Federation of African Women Educationists in South Africa. She has attended conferences on gender equity in higher education at MIT, Harvard, Wellesley College, Radcliffe, and the American Council on Education. I'd like all of you to welcome Naziema Jappie.
I'm always too short for these things. Sometimes I feel it's a good hideout if there's something going on at the back. I first of all want to say thank you to Nihat for this opportunity once again for me to be here in Pakistan. Her telling you about me coming here at my own expense is true, but that's not the issue for me. I think for me the Institute is something that I'm very proud of being a South African, because there's nothing like this in South Africa. And if I can give my work and my support to a country outside of South Africa, then I'm happy for that. I also want to say a very good afternoon to all of you who are here this afternoon. I know you've taken time out to be here. Some of you might know a bit about South Africa, some might not. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically looking at how the customary marriages coexist with the civil marriages, because in South Africa we get married twice. And you have to do that in most cases. And I'm going to first of all give you a sort of background into the South African post-apartheid regime now. I still call it a regime. The colors of governments change, but the bureaucracies don't change. South Africa has actually gone into a phase of what we call the new dawn and the new era. But post-1990, post the apartheid regime, South Africa reversed banning orders, and the liberation movement had actually come to its freedom at some stage. The leaders in the country were unbanned, as you know, and that's fundamentally altering the face of South Africa. In response to various anti-apartheid groups, and especially the trade union movements, and for me, the trade union movements is actually one of my very, very strong points, because my background is being a trade unionist. I've worked in the trade unions for 10 years, and in that area in South Africa was the most crucial times when we had to organize women in trade union to take up so-called arms because of what was happening in the country. A lot of the men were in migrant workforce, so there wasn't time to really organize men as you could organize women in their places at home. So it was a good experience at that stage to start organizing women and to make women aware of what was happening in the country. The growth of gender consciousness actually in South Africa in the years since 1990 has been phenomenal. There has been gender consciousness previously in South Africa, and just this morning on listening to the lectures given by Yashadhara this morning with the students, it made me think of why gender wasn't really an issue during the apartheid regime. Why wasn't it so vivid in people's minds? And that was simply because the men and women, the black men and women in South Africa, did not want to separate themselves on gender issues. They wanted to fight apartheid before they fought among themselves as women and men. And it was quite common in those days for men and women to stand side by side and fight, physically fight against the police force and against various status bureaucracies. So the growth thereafter, after the 1990s, became quite an issue. And even in the politics, in the talks that were happening in the interim government, there was quite a number of issues that were raised, and the gender issues became quite prominent within the talks in the interim government. And you found that women were now participating even more than they did before. I think it was also because of the lack of education. People were also illiterate. There were lots of rural women who were involved, but they had to have some support. And it is for that reason that I thought I would talk about the customary and civil marriages in South Africa, because it's still a sore point in the country. It is still a point that people want to try and develop within the constitution. Although we have a constitution that is very progressive, it's by no means practical in many ways. And the South African constitution envisages a democratic order in which there is equality between men and women. It talks about equality, and it talks about fairness among the people, black and white. And I think it describes itself as a bridge between the past of deeply divided society and a future founded on the recognition of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence, and developmental opportunities for all South Africans. Now, the Constitution says quite a lot in that area, but the Constitution does not really give any kind of support or any kind of technical support, and that's where we have our problems when it comes to marriages. One of the major tasks of reconstructing the state and society was the establishment of structures and mechanisms within the state and civil society to further the equality of women. It is true to say that women are an unequal and disadvantaged group in South Africa even today. This is a systematic and entrenched in structures, in norms and values, and the state and in civil society. And I say this because even though we have 1/3 of our members of parliament being women, you very seldom hear our women in parliament. The emancipation of women and the attainment of equality in the political, economic, social and cultural spheres of life is a long-term process of social transformation that fundamentally challenges the way in which society is organized. Now, I want to place this in some historical context. Because South Africa was a colony, and it was a Dutch colony, our law is basically based on the Roman Dutch law. The historical origins of gender discrimination in South African law must begin with Roman law, because in Roman law there was a very clear concept which they called patria potestas, which simply accorded to a man the power of life and death over his wife and children in certain situations. And that, unfortunately, still prevails in certain tribal areas, in certain sections of South African society. A series of laws against intermarriages, of another example of intersecting forms of discrimination. And this was very, very clear during the apartheid regime. You could not marry across the color line. If you were Indian, you would only marry an Indian, and you wouldn't be able to marry a white person. If you did that, it was the Immorality Act you had to face, and sometimes men faced imprisonment for certain things. So the Roman Dutch law existed even during the apartheid times, and it still exists to this time, but it has changed slightly, and I'll come to that a bit later. In most cases of Roman law, women were principal victims of these laws. Women were prejudiced by a denial of any right to inheritance and any other legal claim which they would have had in regard to male partners if they had been permitted to become lawful wives. And that also became a problem, because in most cases women were not allowed to inherit. Even during the apartheid regime, there were very strict laws. If you had been with a partner and not married to that partner, you found that the Roman Dutch law wouldn't even recognize you at all. But at least the Constitution today has changed that slightly. The Constitution now looks at people who are living together but not married, and what kind of support the person, the female, would get if she were to leave her partner, and so on. So it is a little bit more progressive than what was there during the apartheid regime. I must give you an example. A friend of mine who was married across the color lines during the apartheid time just found herself not being married at all when she went 2 weeks ago to change her identity document because it was not registered. And now she has to go through the entire process, and it is quite a painful process, because now you have kids, and now you've got to say, well, we're not married now, Daddy and I are going to get married again. And the children, our children of today, cannot understand that because they were not born then. They have no idea of what apartheid actually meant. Apartheid actually means separate development. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you know separate development politically, socially, economically, mentally. And even to this day, although there is a new government in place, the subconsciousness in you still brings out that, and you still think, well, I don't know if I can do this, and I'm not sure if I can do that. So those are some of the things that people who have lived through that phase, lived through that regime, still live with it to today. And hopefully the next generation, our kids, will try and make it better. And I'm not so sure, because even in our schools, it's so entrenched that our children still think in terms of, I'm an Indian, therefore I need to mix with an Indian child. I cannot mix with a white child. It took us apart very deeply. And I think it is for that reason, and I'm sure the student who's here from South Africa will tell you, that even though we're free to move, free to live, we still find it very difficult living next to a white person. We still find it very difficult sitting in a classroom next to a white child. And there are various problems that we have culturally as well. So even in terms of marriages, there's still very few marriages that go across the color line, because people are not used to living in an environment that is a togetherness with people. There is no doubt, of course, that customary law is recognized in the Constitution. When I say recognized, I mean it's just recognized. There isn't any kind of law or any kind of legislation for customary law, but they do recognize it. The status of customary law is necessarily confined to such issues as the degree and effects of such recognition. The overriding value in the African family is reflected in the non-individual nature of marriage, sometimes called the collective or the communal aspect of the marriage relationship. This notion embodies the idea of marriage as an alliance between two kinship groups for the purpose of realizing goals beyond the immediate interests of the particular husband and wife. So when two people are getting married, it is not a marriage between two people, it's a marriage between two families. And that is what's very important. This does not mean that the two parties to a marriage are unimportant. They are. But also as a point at which the two families, lineages, clans are joined for the purposes which have community-wide significance. And that is why you will also find, even in the Islamic marriages, even in the Muslim marriages, which is, and I will talk about this a little bit later, it is very difficult. There's still a lot of arranged marriages, as you would know, it happens, I think, in most places. It's the marriages of families. So even if there is going to be some kind of a divorce, it's not the husband and wife who must decide, it's the families that will decide whether this is going to happen or not. And the wife really has no say in the divorce. She cannot say what she wants. She cannot even ask for it in South Africa. The goals of this type of marriage can be summarized as procreation and survival. It is clear that in patriarchal societies, group interests are framed in favor of men. Here is the first indication of why inequality is such an enduring part of an African customary systems. The field of family relations is one in which Africans construct the foundations of their social lives. Certain consequences flow from the fact that a marriage is a tool in the service of broader purpose than the immediate interests of the couple. So it keeps coming up at all times that you will find, even when there are, if a girl sees a boy or a boy sees a girl, it's not about them getting married, it's about whether the family agrees or not. And I think you will find the eldest brother going to the household and seeing whether the girl is fit enough to marry his younger brother or his older brother. And it happens all the time. It even happens with very progressive people I know in South Africa who've invited me and said, come, we're going to see this girl for my brother. You know, and I mean, it's something that you wouldn't want to do. But just out of interest, you go and you see the girls actually line up. And it's like buying an object. For example, the goal of procreation leads to a complex set of rules relating to barrenness, including the surrogate and levirate. The former, of course, requires a younger sister to take the place of a wife who is unable to produce children. And even that I found quite amazing, because if the wife cannot produce, the younger sister must do so. It can also be plausibly argued that a system of marriage where the most important aims are external to the parties involved, where men acquire rights over women and children, but they do not enjoy reciprocal rights, that is the women, and where these men's rights are secured by the movement of cattle, which we call labola, where you have to have, that's like the bride price. This has direct bearing on the subordination of women. So you have to start giving cattle or start saving up for cattle, which is extremely expensive. And the cattle are there for the mother. The mother gets a certain type of cattle, which is an expensive cattle, and so on and so forth. And it sometimes becomes very, very costly. And you'll find that even if a boy has intended to marry someone and does not have all the cattle in hand, he cannot marry until such time the cattle are there. So immediately you can see the way in which this relationship occurs in African marriages. The construction of official or defensive customary law has grave consequences for women. Firstly, it reinforced patriarchal norms in terms of which males were accorded superior status in society. Secondly, was that the existing separation between the public and private spheres of life became more rigid. This also strengthened the division of labor because women were clearly told that their work was in the home. Their work was more domesticated. Thirdly, women became outlaws. They were deprived of manipulating the law of rules to their advantage. Even when the constitution was being done, there were women in the committees, but unfortunately could not voice their opinions. Even if they did, it was just heard, but never really taken into account, and that is why we find this coexistence of the two marriages. Family law thus generates a vast number of problem areas, which include marriageable age, the grounds for divorce, lobola, polygamy, legal capacity, personal status, child maintenance, custody, and guardianship. The primary problem for women is that the customary law, in its present form, is fundamentally incompatible with what we call the Section 8, which is the Equality and Non-Discrimination Clause in our Constitution. Some people argue that the Constitution should not have recognized customary laws. But my view on this is that it was inevitable. It was inevitable because we have a country in which at least 3/4 of its population is black. Further argument is that it is the right of people to be governed by laws they recognize and accept. That is part of the right to self-determination. The problems associated, though, with this is not basically the recognition of the marriage in the Constitution, but the technical problems that arise from the fact that a dual system is maintained. Section 229 of the Constitution attempts to ensure an orderly transition from the old order to a new constitutional dispensation by providing that all laws will continue in force until amended or repealed. Now, it is very difficult because whilst the Constitution is recognizing the Islamic marriages, it recognizes the African marriages, there are these technical problems because on the one hand, the civil marriages clearly state it should not be polygamous. The African marriages is polygamous and so is the Islamic marriages. So there are those type of problems, and we've had a number of issues which have gone to the Constitutional Court and where women have now been granted the right even if they were the second, third, or fourth, or fifth wife. And the Constitution then looks individually at every case. And that is where the technical problems come in. It's for those judges who sit in the Constitutional Court have to make these decisions. And our Constitutional Court actually has 12 judges, in fact 13 judges who sit. And we have 13 because if there is any kind of voting, then we know there's always one that will be the majority. So there are these 13 judges who make decisions on individual cases that come to court in terms of the dual marriage system. And I believe from what I've heard that there are lots more of these kind of cases coming to court. The other example that I want to relate to is also in terms of what we used to have in the apartheid times. We used to have what we call homelands. We used to have little sort of countries within South Africa, little homelands governed by their own presidents and their own They had their own government, basically. And Transkei was one of these areas. And Transkei has had a marriage act as well of its own. What happened with the new constitution was that that was basically taken into account into the new constitution. Now, the questions that arise then is, does this mean that polygamous marriages are recognized by South African laws? And what has happened to the Roman Dutch law? Does the constitution create certain difficulties of detail and of policy? Muslim women, of course, in South Africa face similar status. They have problems in private and public spheres of life, and it is the same as their non-Muslim counterparts. The Muslim women in South Africa basically form their own groups, try and discuss issues, and you must understand that we are in the minority in South Africa. We form basically 1.1% of the South African population, but it's a very, very strong minority in South Africa. It's a minority that is also very economically viable in South Africa. And for that reason, you will find that in every sphere of the politics, whether it's the social side or the economic side, the Muslim community is always involved. Even the state of trying to get Muslim women to participate in marches, when we had all the movements, the apartheid, during the anti-apartheid movement, you actually found women coming into that and trying to participate as Muslim women, trying to put forward Islam and say what Islam is about and try and help in that way, and the support groups for orphanages and so on. So the Muslim women in South Africa are very, very small, but at the same time they are also very vocal. The first Muslims, of course, in South Africa arrived in the Cape. And they arrived, and we were just talking about it just now, from the Dutch colonies in the East Indies, which today is known as Indonesia, and the coastal regions of India. And this happened between 1652 and 1658. And they were granted freedom to practice their religion only in the year 1804. So there was some sort of suppression of the religion itself during the time that they were there. Many of them had come as slaves. Many of them came in as indentured laborers on the farms and so on. Muslims constitute, as I say, 1.1% of the population, whereas Christians make up 66.5% of the population. So every aspect of South African law, of South African education, is Christianity. The education system also is based on Christianity. With that, I think a lot of the Muslims decided to build their own schools and teach Islam to their children, because this was not being done anywhere else. One of the things that I did find, and I still find, is that it is a very strong community in terms of being supportive to one another. And you will find that the South African Muslims in general belong to what is known as the Sunni school of Islamic law. Explanation of the legal and social status of Muslim women requires some reference to Islamic law, which evolved in the 7th century, and the South African Constitution, which includes the Bill of Rights, which outlaws discrimination on grounds of sex. The question is how such safeguards of fundamental rights might coexist with the recognition of the Muslim personal law, Muslim marriages, etc. And I think it's the same questions that we ask when we ask about the African law of customary marriages and the Muslim marriages. You will find that it is a lot more common these days for people to get married more than once. My example was the same. I got married the Muslim way, and I find it, I always have this talk with Nifat, it's very different from the way you do it here in Pakistan. When Muslim women get married in South Africa, you are not part of the nikah ceremony, as it were. You get married by proxy. So which means you do not even sign any papers. Your uncles, your two uncles actually marry you off, and they sign on behalf of you. So you are not present at the nikah ceremony itself. And it's something that I found very different. There is no contractual agreement in a marriage. So, even in the divorce, you are not allowed really to say you want the divorce. That has to come from the other side. But now I think the women are being more progressive and they are approaching the imams and so on, and the imams are getting a bit more strict and saying, you can't come and talk to us, you must send your husband. So it's those type of things that we are facing at the moment, and there are talks around how to get certain marriages nullified and so on. So I found, for me, the strange thing about the way in which the marriages were conducted, because I thought in Islam everyone got married the same way. But unfortunately, it does not seem so. And when I went back after I was here the last time, and I told people this, and they said, no, that's Pakistan. So I said, what's so different about being a Muslim in Pakistan and being a Muslim in South Africa? And those actually raised tensions in the discussion group that I was in. Because some women felt that it's good if they're not at the nikah. And I don't know why they felt that way. And other women said, no, but she's right, I mean, look, those women are there, they're signing contracts, they're performing it correctly, as if it were a marriage, and why aren't we doing that? So there are various kinds of ways in which people are looking at this. What are the chances for Muslim women in South Africa to reap benefits of the Bill of Rights? If we really look at it in details, there are no chances for women in Islam or Muslim women in South Africa to actually reap any benefits of the Bill of Rights, simply because the interpretations are very male-dominated, and what happens is men and women in South Africa are becoming more fundamentalist. So you will find that even in terms of dress code, there are lots and lots of women going into parda. Muslims are subjected to male and male-dominated religious bodies who continue to regulate and control their lives in accord with the traditional interpretations of Islamic law. And I think one of the things that's very, very critical and very important at this stage is to understand that anything to do with Islam in South Africa is male-dominated. Even at functions, you will find that it's very, very male-dominated. Women they try very hard to have their own functions. They try to have their own little get-togethers, but somehow they are criticized for that. And there's been questioning around this dual coexistence of marriages, and how does the Constitution actually address these issues of if there is a divorce, what happens to the second wife or the third wife and so on. And I think one of the things to understand is that in South Africa it is much more, it's a debatable issue because the community is so small, and you will find that people are very much now open to talking about these issues. Previously we had to repress ourselves. We could not say things in the open, we could not say things at public lectures. But at the moment you find that you can see this emergence of some kind of awareness among the women and among both African and Indian women in South Africa. Now, it also brings me to the question of where do the white women actually fit into all of this? And when you discuss these issues with the white feminists in South Africa, they really do not understand it. They do not understand it simply because they do not know what the traditions are and what the cultures are and what the religion actually requires. And therefore it's very difficult to get support from your white counterparts in these type of issues when they need to be discussed at certain levels, and even within parliamentary levels. One of the criticisms, though, of the women who were sitting on the Constitutional Committee was that those women who were in the Constitutional Committee did not take either religion or tradition or culture into account, because they didn't feel that those things were important to them. But they didn't realize how those things would actually affect women outside of their lives. And what happened was, when they sat in the Constitutional Committee, they sat there just as an ordinary person and said, because we are ANC members or we are members of a political party, we're not going to consider these religious issues. And I think that was a fault, simply because today those very issues are coming to the forefront. And people are now starting to question, why wasn't it being discussed? So the Constitution, in fact, has had problems in terms of dealing with these matters when it comes to the front. The other areas, of course, were recently there was an issue which also raised the questions where an imam who actually touched one of the students on her breasts. And one of the magistrates, a female magistrate, said, it might be a religious issue, but according to South African law, this is not a criminal offense. It has nothing to do with the South African law. And immediately there was an uproar, simply because what does that actually mean? And she said, it's probably cultural, you know. And the women who were actually in that court at that time really made a fuss of the issue there, and they were all asked to leave. But, you know, the magistrate herself, unknowingly, you put people into places hoping these are progressive women who will start understanding issues much deeper than what is on the surface. We find that this is not happening. And these are the issues we're starting to grapple with our counterparts who are in parliament, who are in very senior positions in government, but are not actually helping the situation in the country. And this imam, of course, was not even bailed out, he was just let go free. And this happened just last week. And I think, you know, even if one has to look at what sexual harassment means, this gives some kind of signal to people, yeah, you can touch little kids wherever you want, and it doesn't make any difference. So, and if a magistrate can say so, and being a woman magistrate, I think even more so gives signal to men that they can do whatever they want, because their religion somehow allows these things. And, you know, it is those type of things that we are trying very, very hard to try and make sure that it does not happen. But we can only do it if there is some sort of support. So, you know, the coexistence of the dual marriages in South Africa will be there, I think, for quite some time. And you find that it will actually start creating much more problems in the times to come, because it is not addressed, and it's still not being addressed as it should be in Parliament or even in the Constitutional Court. Constitutional Court is actually just dealing with cases ad hocly, as they come one by one. So each case is on a different merit, differently treated, and you'll find that in some cases women are given the benefit of the doubt. In other cases they are not. So the issues of customary laws with even the tribes, the chiefs of the tribes, have the power to say yes or no. They still do, and you find it's very difficult for women to stand up and say, I would like a divorce, or I would like to go and marry so-and-so. It is still not the right of women to decide who they would like to marry. And in most cases, you marry outside of your religion, or outside of your color line, or outside of your tribe, you are seen as an outcast. And simply the families then will have nothing to do with you. And if there are children out of that marriages, it's even worse, because they are not recognized at all by the community. So South Africa, although has gone through quite a lot, and we're trying to sort of redefine certain areas within the country, I think we still have a long way to go. We have a lot to learn from other countries, and hoping that somehow we will try and stabilize certain situations within the country. But as I said, our first and foremost task was to get over the hurdle of apartheid, to move from that system. And coming into the new system, I think, is now giving us the challenges which we are facing. We are facing all these challenges, and we want to try and make those become reality. We want to try and make sure that the women's movement is not lost in South Africa. And I think it is losing its essence, as it were, in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The women's movement is not as strong in South Africa as it was. And I was just talking to Yashodhara about even the labor movement itself is not as strong. We found that previously they had been the ones who were leading the way. It is now the exact opposite. Management is leading the way. And we find government being given support to management to lead the way. So what is happening is there's a polarization. And there is an emergence of a new kind of trade unionism, a new kind of women's grouping in South Africa. And these are not focusing on the issues that are particular to women, especially in the rural areas, women who face these type of problems in their marriages. They are not focusing on those issues. So all I want to end up by saying is that we are trying to redefine, we are trying to work at some of these issues, but we're trying to do it through very little support. And hopefully we would like to get, and I said to Nikat, I'd like to get her out to South Africa at some stage to try and talk to people about these issues. Because we are not far from where you are, but I think there are certain areas where you are much more advanced than South Africa is. Thank you very much.